I am a forensic accountant. I spend 60 hours a week tracking the money that criminals, embezzlers, and corporate fraudsters desperately try to hide. I look for the anomalies, the missing decimal points, the sudden offshore transfers. I live in a world of absolute, unyielding logic. But on a Tuesday evening in late October, my world of logic completely shattered. It was raining. I was driving home after an incredibly grueling 10-hour shift at the firm. As I turned onto my quiet, suburban street, I saw a familiar black Mercedes SUV pulling away from the curb near my house. I recognized the license plate instantly. It was my mother's car. I didn't think much of it. Marjorie Vale, my mother, was a deeply wealthy, incredibly cold woman who occasionally dropped off expensive, highly impersonal gifts for my 6-year-old son, Miles. We weren't close. My family had always viewed me as the disappointing, working-class daughter who chose to crunch numbers instead of marrying into old money like my sister, Bianca. I parked my car in the driveway, grabbed my heavy leather briefcase, and walked up to the front porch. Sitting directly in the center of the welcome mat was a small, square box wrapped in expensive silver foil paper. I unlocked the front door. The house was entirely silent. "Evan?" I called out, setting my briefcase on the floor. My husband, Evan, was supposed to be home watching Miles. Evan was an investment broker. He was charming, reasonably successful, and usually very attentive to our son. "Miles?" I called again, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet hallway. There was no answer. I frowned, picking up the silver box from the porch. I carried it into the kitchen and set it on the granite counter. Attached to the silver ribbon was a small, heavy cardstock envelope. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten card. I immediately recognized my mother's elegant, perfectly looped handwriting. It didn't say hello. It didn't offer a greeting. It simply read, "Do not make a scene, Annalise." A cold, incredibly sharp spike of panic immediately shot through my chest. I tore the silver paper off the box and pulled the lid open. Resting on a bed of white tissue paper was a small, thick, black silicone band. I stared at it, my brain completely refusing to process what I was looking at. It was a GPS tracking bracelet. I had bought it for Miles a year ago. It was highly secure, locking around his wrist with a specialized magnetic key that only I possessed. I was a forensic accountant who worked with the FBI. I understood the dangers of the world, and I was deeply protective of my son. Miles wore it every single day. The bracelet in the box was completely dead. The heavy silicone band had been violently severed, cut cleanly in half by what looked like heavy industrial shears. Tucked underneath the severed bracelet was a second piece of paper. "He is with his real family now." I stopped breathing. The kitchen seemed to violently tilt around me. "Miles!" I screamed, the sound tearing out of my throat, raw and completely terrified. I dropped the box and sprinted down the hallway. I threw open the door to Miles's bedroom. It was empty. I ran to the mudroom. His favorite blue backpack was missing. His winter jacket was gone. My 6-year-old son was gone. I didn't hesitate. I didn't try to call my mother. I didn't try to reason with the note. I pulled my phone from my pocket and immediately dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency?" The dispatcher answered calmly. "My son," I gasped, pacing frantically in the kitchen, staring at the severed GPS bracelet. "My son has been taken. He's 6 years old. I came home and he's gone, and someone cut his tracking bracelet off and left it in a box on my porch." 10 minutes later, 2 local police cruisers roared into my driveway, their blue and red lights flashing aggressively through the rainy windows of my living room. 2 uniformed officers stepped into the kitchen. I was hyperventilating, holding the severed bracelet and the notes. "Ma'am, please calm down," the older officer said, taking out his notepad. "Who was supposed to be watching the child?" "My husband, Evan," I said, my voice shaking violently. "But he's not answering his phone. I think my parents took Miles. My mother left this note. She wrote that he's with his real family now. You have to send someone to their house right now." Before the officer could look at the note, the heavy front door opened. Evan walked into the house, shaking the rain off his expensive trench coat. He froze in the hallway when he saw the police officers standing in the kitchen. "What's going on?" Evan asked, his voice tight. "Why are the police here?" I ran toward him, grabbing the lapels of his coat. "Evan, where is Miles? My parents took him. They cut off his bracelet." Evan looked at me, then looked past me to the kitchen counter. His eyes locked onto the silver box and the severed black silicone band resting inside it. All the color instantly, violently drained from Evan's face. He turned a sickly, horrifying shade of gray. He looked completely, utterly terrified. "Please don't tell me they actually did it," Evan whispered, his voice cracking, barely audible. The police officers didn't hear him, but I did. "Please don't tell me they actually did it." My hands slowly released the lapels of his coat. I stepped back, staring at the man I had been married to for 7 years. He didn't ask where Miles was. He didn't panic. He knew. He had known they were coming. "Evan," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "What did you do?" Evan blinked, snapping out of his shock. He looked at the police officers, who were watching him closely, and his demeanor instantly, drastically changed. The terrified husband completely vanished, replaced by a smooth, deeply patronizing performance. "Officers, I am so incredibly sorry for wasting your time," Evan said, forcing a calm, reassuring smile onto his face as he walked into the kitchen. "This is a massive misunderstanding. There is no kidnapping." "Evan, what are you doing?" I demanded, my panic morphing into a cold, profound horror. "Annalise has been incredibly unstable lately," Evan explained to the officers, speaking over me, adopting the tone of a deeply concerned, exhausted spouse. "She's a forensic accountant. She works 80-hour weeks. She's completely burned out. She's been having severe panic attacks and making irrational decisions regarding our son." "That is a lie," I shouted, staring at him in absolute disbelief. "We had a long discussion this morning," Evan continued smoothly, completely ignoring my outburst. "We agreed that Miles should spend a few weeks with her parents at their estate, while Annalise seeks inpatient psychiatric treatment. Her mother just came to pick him up." "He's lying," I screamed, turning to the older officer. "Look at the note. She cut off his GPS bracelet. She said he's with his real family. Does that sound like a planned vacation?" The older officer frowned, looking at the handwritten notes and the severed bracelet. He looked back at Evan. "Sir, did you consent to the child leaving the premises?" the officer asked formally. "Absolutely," Evan nodded confidently. "I am Miles's legal adoptive father. I packed his bags myself. The tracking bracelet it was causing Annalise intense paranoia. Her parents removed it to give the boy some normalcy." The officer sighed, closing his notepad. "Ma'am," the officer said, turning to me, his tone shifting from urgent to deeply bureaucratic. "If the child's legal father consented to him leaving with his grandparents, this is not a kidnapping. This is a civil custody dispute. He was taken without my permission," I argued desperately. "I am his mother, and he is his father," the officer replied firmly. "We cannot intervene in family arrangements. If you disagree with where the child is staying, you need to contact a family law attorney tomorrow morning and file a petition with the court. Have a good evening." The two officers walked out of the kitchen, entirely abandoning me to the nightmare. The front door clicked shut. The heavy silence of the empty house crashed down around us. I turned slowly to look at Evan. He wasn't performing anymore. He walked over to his briefcase, opened it, and pulled out a thick stack of highly official-looking legal documents. He tossed them onto the kitchen counter, right next to the severed GPS bracelet. "Sit down, Annalise," Evan said coldly. "We need to talk." I didn't sit down. I stared at the legal documents. The heavy watermark on the paper belonged to Cross and Whitman, LLP. It was the massive, highly ruthless corporate law firm where my brother-in-law, Julian Cross, was a senior partner. "What is this, Evan?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. "It's a formal, legally binding custody transfer," Evan stated, crossing his arms. "Julian drafted it this afternoon. I have already signed it, explicitly granting full, permanent physical and legal custody of Miles to your sister, Bianca." The absolute breathtaking cruelty of the plan finally snapped into focus. My sister, Bianca, the golden child, the beautiful, incredibly spoiled daughter who lived in a massive estate called Ravenwood. Bianca had suffered through 5 years of failed IVF treatments. She was entirely, irreversibly infertile. 2 years ago, Bianca had attempted to adopt a child, but the private adoption agencies had run a background check. They found her 2 severe DUI convictions and a highly sealed psychiatric hold from her early 20s. Every single reputable agency had categorically rejected her application. She couldn't buy a child legally, so she decided to steal mine. "You gave my son to Bianca," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "It's for the best, Annalise," Evan justified, completely devoid of empathy. "Be realistic. Bianca and Julian have a massive mansion. They have unlimited resources. They can give Miles the life of a billionaire. You work constantly. You're exhausted. They are the family he actually deserves." He was using my mother's exact words. Real family. They didn't view Miles as a human being. They viewed him as an asset, a luxury item that the golden child desperately wanted, and that the working-class daughter was entirely unworthy of keeping. "You think a piece of paper drafted by Julian means anything to me?" I asked, my voice rising with a lethal, terrifying clarity. "I am his mother. I will drag all of you into court tomorrow morning, and I will tear Bianca's life apart." Evan shook his head, a dark, incredibly arrogant smile touching his lips. "You won't do that, Annalise," Evan said confidently, "because Julian didn't just draft a custody transfer. He drafted a psychological evaluation. We have sworn affidavits from my therapist, stating that your stressful job has caused a massive mental breakdown. We have the police report from tonight, documenting you screaming and acting hysterically." Evan leaned forward, placing his hands on the granite counter. "If you fight this," Evan warned, "Julian will bury you. He will drag you through family court for 5 years. He will prove you are completely unfit to be a mother. You will lose your job, you will lose your money, and you will still lose Miles. Sign the papers, Annalise. Your father is willing to be generous. He'll give you a massive settlement to walk away quietly." I looked at Evan. I looked at the man who had kissed me that morning, the man who had played catch with Miles in the backyard. He had sold us out. He had sold my 6-year-old son to a toxic, unstable woman, completely orchestrated by a ruthless corporate lawyer and funded by my deeply arrogant parents. They thought they had built an impenetrable legal cage. They thought they had trapped a hysterical, exhausted mother who would eventually surrender under the crushing weight of their immense wealth and legal power. They made a catastrophic miscalculation. They forgot what I do for a living. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I turned around, walked down the hallway, and grabbed my heavy leather briefcase. I walked back into the kitchen, picked up the severed GPS bracelet, and dropped it into my bag. "Where are you going?" Evan demanded, his arrogant smile faltering slightly. "Annalise, we aren't done talking." "Yes, we are, Evan," I said softly, my voice cold and completely empty. I walked out the front door, into the pouring rain, and drove away from the house. I didn't go to the police station. The police had already proven they wouldn't help me. I didn't go to my parents' mansion. If I showed up screaming at their gates, Julian would use it as absolute proof of my mental instability. I drove downtown, checked into the Harbor Executive Suites under a fake corporate alias, and locked the heavy security door of my room. I sat down at the small glass desk. I pulled my heavy, highly encrypted work laptop from my briefcase. I plugged it in, booted up the secure operating system, and connected to my private VPN. My husband had just confidently told me that my father was willing to pay a massive settlement to make me walk away. But Preston Vale was a businessman. He didn't just pay the victim, he paid the accomplice. Evan hadn't sold his son for free. He wasn't that generous. I opened my forensic tracing software. I was going to audit my husband's entire existence, and I was going to find exactly how much it cost to buy a human being. I spent the first 2 hours doing what I do best, legally bypassing basic security protocols. Evan used the same simple password for almost everything. I accessed his secondary iCloud backup, pulling down 3 years of deeply hidden text messages, deleted emails, and encrypted financial app data. I didn't start by looking for my parents. I started by looking for the motive. Evan was a coward, but he loved his comfortable life. He wouldn't risk federal kidnapping charges unless he was completely desperate. At 1 a.m., I found the desperation. Deep inside a heavily encrypted folder on his phone, I uncovered a series of offshore betting applications. Evan wasn't just a casual sports bettor. He was a massive, highly addicted gambler. I traced the offshore ledgers. The numbers were catastrophic. Over the last 18 months, Evan had completely drained his private investment portfolios. He had taken out massive, high-interest personal loans. But the worst part was the syndicate debt. He owed an illegal offshore bookmaking operation exactly $500,000. I opened his deleted text messages and found a terrifying trail of threats from the bookies. "We know where you work, Evan. Asterisk, we know what school your kid goes to. You have 30 days to clear the $500 K, or we break your legs and burn your office." The threats escalated violently, day after day, week after week. Evan was clearly panicking, begging for more time, promising them a massive payout. And then, exactly 2 weeks ago, the threatening messages abruptly stopped. The final message from the syndicate was incredibly brief. "Account settled. Do not contact us again." I stared at the screen. Evan didn't have $500,000. His accounts were completely empty. Someone had paid his debt for him. Someone had bought his compliance. I launched a massive, deep dive forensic audit into Evan's financial architecture. I bypassed his standard checking accounts and began hunting for shell companies. At 3 a.m., I found it. Registered under a fake address in Delaware, Evan was the sole managing director of a shell company called Northlake Advisory LLC. I hacked into the corporate banking portal for Northlake. The ledger was entirely empty, except for a single, massive transaction recorded exactly 14 days ago. An incoming wire transfer of $500,000. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I ran a highly complex reverse lookup on the routing number that had sent the massive wire. I expected it to trace directly back to my father's corporate accounts at Vail Capital Holdings. But it didn't. The money hadn't come directly from my parents. It had been professionally laundered. The $500,000 wire originated from the massive, highly secure trust and escrow account of Cross and Whitman LLP, my brother-in-law's law firm. Julian Cross wasn't just drafting fake custody papers. He was actively, maliciously laundering the bribe money through his law firm's heavily protected trust accounts to hide the financial trail. He was moving dirty money to buy my son. I immediately breached Evan's archived emails, searching specifically for communications with Julian and my father. It didn't take long to find the blueprint of their betrayal. They hadn't even bothered to use highly encrypted servers. They were so incredibly arrogant, so completely confident in their wealth and legal power, they had discussed the entire conspiracy in plain text. I opened an email chain titled "Family Arrangement." It was an active conversation between Preston Vail, Evan Porter, and Julian Cross. Preston, my father, Evan, "The gambling debt is a massive liability to this family's reputation. I will clear the $505K with the offshore accounts. In exchange, you will legally sign over full custody of Miles to Bianca. She deserves a child. You are clearly unfit to raise him. Evan." "Preston, I can't just give Annalise's son away. She will lose her mind. She'll go to the police." "Julian, my brother-in-law. Evan, let me handle Annalise. You provide the signature as the adoptive father. We do the transfer when she is at work. I will draft a highly restrictive custody transfer and a psychological evaluation stating she is suffering from severe corporate burnout and is mentally unstable. If she goes to the police, it's a civil dispute. If she tries to fight it in family court, I will bury her in litigation for 5 years and use her hysteria against her. You take the money, sign the paper, and keep your legs unbroken." They had engineered an absolute, flawless legal trap. They knew the police wouldn't intervene in a civil custody dispute if one parent consented. They knew family court was a slow, agonizing process. They were planning to bleed me dry, while Bianca played mother in her massive mansion. I kept digging. I opened Evan's group messages. I found a family group chat. It included Evan, my father, my mother, Bianca, and Julian. I was the only family member excluded. I scrolled through weeks of messages. The sheer breathtaking toxicity was almost physically sickening. "Bianca, Have you guys bought the new nursery furniture yet? I want the luxury Italian crib for Miles. He needs to get out of that awful, cramped house Annalise keeps him in. Marjorie, my mother. Oh, darling, we ordered it yesterday. Miles will finally be in an environment that reflects his true potential. Annalise is just a working-class accountant. She doesn't understand the kind of pedigree a child needs to succeed. You will be a wonderful mother. Julian. Just make sure Annalise doesn't find out until the transfer is complete. I need her completely blindsided so she acts irrationally when the police arrive. I need that police report to establish her mental instability. I push the laptop away, my hands shaking violently with a profound, terrifying anger. They hadn't just stolen my son. They had actively, maliciously conspired to destroy my sanity, my career, and my life, simply to appease my sister's massive, entitled ego. Julian thought he was an absolute mastermind. He thought his legal strategy was entirely bulletproof. He had built a massive, complex fortress of forged documents, psychological evaluations, and laundered bribe money. But as I sat in the quiet hotel room at 4 a.m., looking at the legal custody transfer Julian had so carefully drafted, a cold, incredibly sharp realization suddenly struck me. Julian Cross was a brilliant corporate lawyer. He handled massive mergers and acquisitions. He was used to dealing with multi-million-dollar contracts. But he wasn't a family law attorney. He didn't understand the intricate, highly complex nuances of custody dockets. He had drafted the entire kidnapping scheme completely dependent on one single critical factor: Evan's signature as the legal adoptive father. The police had walked away because Evan had consented. Julian's entire legal defense rested on the premise that Evan possessed the legal authority to transfer custody. Julian had been incredibly thorough, but he had forgotten to check the county family court docket. 12 months ago, Evan had been sued by a former client for massive financial mismanagement. It was a vicious civil lawsuit, completely separate from his gambling debts. Evan had been terrified that the client would try to pierce the corporate veil and aggressively target our personal assets, including Miles's college fund. To protect our assets from the lawsuit, I had forced Evan to sign a highly specific, heavily sealed legal document. I logged directly into the secure portal of the county family court system. I bypassed the public records and accessed the sealed files using my forensic credentials. I found the document. I downloaded it. I opened the PDF on my screen. It was a voluntary relinquishment of parental rights and transfer of sole custody 12 months ago. To protect his own money from a civil lawsuit, Evan Porter had legally, formally, and permanently surrendered his entire legal status as Miles's father. The judge had signed the order, granting me 100% sole legal and physical custody of my son. Evan wasn't Miles's legal father anymore. He hadn't been for a year. He possessed absolutely zero legal authority to consent to anything. I stared at the document, a slow, terrifying, deeply lethal smile spreading across my face. Julian's entire legal defense had just completely, violently evaporated. The police had left my house because they thought it was a civil dispute between two legal parents. But Evan wasn't a legal parent, which meant his consent was completely, utterly void. This wasn't a civil custody dispute anymore. Miles had been taken from his sole legal guardian, against her will, and transported across state lines to my sister's massive estate in Connecticut. They hadn't executed a legal custody transfer. They had just committed federal kidnapping. And because they used Julian's law firm trust account to wire $500,000 to an offshore shell company to facilitate the kidnapping, they had also committed massive federal wire fraud, bribery, and severe money laundering. My family thought they were playing a local game of family court chess. They didn't realize they had just walked directly into a massive federal criminal indictment. I didn't sleep. For the next 3 hours, I built an absolute, impenetrable encrypted dossier. I compiled the offshore gambling debts, the threatening text messages, the $500,000 wire transfer from Julian's law firm, the email conspiracy chain, the severed GPS bracelet, and the certified, judge-signed sole custody order, proving Evan had absolutely no legal rights. At 7 a.m., I picked up my phone and dialed a highly secure, unlisted number. I didn't call the local police. I didn't call a family lawyer. I called Mateo Reyes. Agent Reyes was a senior investigator for the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We had worked together on 3 massive corporate embezzlement cases. He knew me, he respected me, and he knew that I never, ever used the term federal crime unless I had the absolute, undeniable paper trail to back it up. Analyze, Agent Reyes answered, his voice thick with sleep. Do you know what time it is? Mateo, I said, my voice completely devoid of panic, echoing with a cold, absolute professionalism. I need you to meet me at the 49th Street Diner in exactly 30 minutes. Bring a secure laptop. I have a massive, fully documented case of federal wire fraud, money laundering, and extortion. I'm listening, Reyes said, instantly awake, hearing the intense gravity in my voice. And Mateo, I added softly, the maternal rage finally bleeding through the icy exterior. The extortion involves the federal kidnapping of my 6-year-old son. I hung up the phone. I packed my laptop, grabbed my briefcase, and walked out of the hotel room. My family wanted to play games with my son. I was going to completely, utterly destroy their entire world. I sat in a quiet booth at the back of the 49th Street Diner, sipping black coffee. The rain was still pouring outside, casting a heavy gray light over the city. Agent Mateo Reyes walked into the diner exactly 30 minutes later. He was a tall, sharply dressed man with intense eyes and a completely no-nonsense demeanor. He slid into the booth across from me, placing a highly secure, heavily encrypted FBI laptop on the table. Talk to me, Annalise, Reyes said, skipping the pleasantries entirely. Who took Miles? I didn't give him an emotional story. I didn't cry. I spoke to him in the exact language we use to dismantle massive corporate fraud syndicates. I handed him a secure flash drive containing the entire encrypted dossier. Last night, my parents and my sister removed Miles from my home without my consent. I stated clearly. They left his severed GPS tracking bracelet in a box on my porch, with a note indicating permanent removal. Reyes plugged the flash drive into his laptop, his eyes scanning the files as they decrypted. The local police report says your husband consented to the removal, making it a civil matter. My husband, Evan Porter, surrendered his parental rights 12 months ago to avoid civil liability in a financial mismanagement suit. I replied, pointing to a specific file on the screen. Open document 4. It is a certified, judge-signed sole custody order. I am the sole legal and physical guardian of Miles. Evan's consent is legally void. Reyes opened the document. His eyes widened slightly as he read the judge's signature. The entire legal foundation of the kidnapping had just completely collapsed. Okay, Reyes said, his voice tightening with professional intensity. That elevates it immediately. We have an unauthorized removal by non-custodial individuals. But you mentioned wire fraud and money laundering. Evan didn't just let them take him, I explained, leaning forward. Open the financial ledgers. Evan owed an illegal offshore gambling syndicate exactly $500,000. The threats were severe. 2 weeks ago, the debt was completely cleared. Reyes opened the banking traces, his eyes rapidly scanning the highly complex financial architecture I had mapped out. I traced the payment, I continued, my voice cold and precise. My father, Preston Vale, authorized a $500 Zero transfer from Vale Capital Holdings. However, he did not send it directly to Evan. He routed the money through the heavily protected escrow trust account of Cross & Whitman LLP, the law firm where my brother-in-law, Julian Cross, is a senior partner. Reyes stopped reading. He looked up at me, a profound, almost terrifying realization dawning on his face. Julian Cross washed the bribe money through his law firm's trust account, Reyes whispered, completely stunned by the sheer arrogance of the crime. Exactly, I nodded. Julian washed the money, transferred it to a Delaware shell company controlled by Evan, and Evan used it to pay the offshore syndicate. In exchange, Evan provided a legally void signature on a fake custody transfer document that Julian drafted to confuse the local police. I leaned back in the booth, letting the absolute magnitude of the evidence settle over the table. Mateo, I said softly. They didn't just take my son, they bought him. And they used a major corporate law firm to launder the purchase money. Rye stared at the screen for a long, heavy moment. He wasn't looking at a family dispute anymore. He was looking at a massive, highly documented federal conspiracy that involved some of the wealthiest, most influential people in the city. Annalise, Reyes said slowly, closing the laptop. This is an incredibly solid paper trail, but Julian Cross is a shark. If I go to a federal judge for a warrant based entirely on digital traces, Julian will bury us in injunctions. He'll claim the money was a legitimate legal retainer. He'll claim Evan lied to him about the custody order. He will muddy the waters for months, and Miles will stay in their mansion the entire time. I know, I replied calmly. Digital evidence can be debated by expensive lawyers. We need a live confession, Reyes stated, leaning forward. I need Julian Cross, Preston Vale, and Evan Porter on tape, explicitly discussing the exchange of money for the child. If I have that, I can authorize a tactical raid and arrest them on the spot. I can get the confession, I said, entirely unbothered by the incredible danger of the task. Reyes looked at me closely. Annalise, these people are incredibly toxic. If you walk into that mansion wearing a wire, you are stepping into a viper's nest. They will try to break you psychologically. They think they already broke me, Mateo, I replied softly. They think I am a hysterical, exhausted mother who is absolutely terrified of their wealth and their lawyers. They expect me to surrender. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened a blank text message addressed to my mother, Marjorie Vale. They built a massive, arrogant legal trap to destroy me, I said, typing the message quickly. I am going to walk directly into it, and I am going to let them spring it. And while they are gloating about how incredibly smart they are, you are going to be listening to every single word. I hit send. The message to my mother was simple, pathetic, and entirely defeated. Please, I surrender. Just let me see him one last time before you finalize the paperwork. 10 seconds later, my phone buzzed with a reply. Marjorie, we are having a welcome party for Miles at Ravenwood Estate tonight at 8 p.m. You may come to say goodbye. Do not cause a scene, or Julian will ensure you never see him again. I looked up at Agent Reyes. Get your tactical team ready, Mateo, I said coldly. I'm bringing the FBI to the party. At 7:45 p.m., I sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked FBI surveillance van parked half a mile down the road from the massive, heavily gated entrance of Ravenwood Estate. An FBI technician leaned over me, securing a tiny, highly advanced microphone inside the lapel of my trench coat. Audio is clear, Agent Reyes, the technician reported, adjusting equally on the massive soundboard in the back of the van. Agent Reyes looked at me. He was wearing full tactical gear, a heavy Kevlar vest reading FBI in massive yellow letters. Surrounding the van were 3 black Suburbans filled with heavily armed federal agents, waiting for the signal to breach the gates. Remember the objective, Annalise, Reyes instructed firmly. Do not engage in an emotional argument. You need them to explicitly discuss the $500,000 payment, Evan's gambling debt, and Julian's role in processing the transfer. We need the conspiracy on tape. If you feel unsafe, or if they try to move Miles, you say the safe word accounting and we breach immediately. I understand, I replied, my voice completely steady. I stepped out of the van into the cold, rainy night and walked to my car. I drove up the winding, meticulously landscaped driveway of Ravenwood Estate. The massive mansion was brightly lit, glowing aggressively in the darkness. Through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see dozens of people mingling in the grand foyer. Bianca and Julian weren't just keeping my son hostage. They were hosting a party. A deeply arrogant, highly public, welcome home celebration to display their newly acquired child to the local elite. I parked my car, took a slow, deep breath to steady my nerves, and walked up the massive stone steps to the front door. I didn't knock. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open and stepped into the foyer. The scene was absolutely sickening. A string quartet was playing classical music in the corner. Waiters carrying trays of expensive champagne circulated through the crowd of local politicians, wealthy real estate developers, and corporate executives. And standing directly in the center of the room, wearing a stunning designer gown and holding a glass of champagne, was my sister, Bianca. Standing next to her was Miles. He was wearing a stiff, uncomfortable-looking little suit that he clearly hated. He looked incredibly pale, deeply confused, and terrified by the massive crowd of strangers. The absolute second I stepped into the room, Miles saw me. "Mommy!" Miles screamed, his voice shattering the polite, wealthy hum of the party. He broke away from Bianca's grip and sprinted across the polished marble floor. I dropped to my knees, opening my arms, and caught him as he crashed into me. He buried his face in my neck, sobbing violently, his small hands clutching my trench coat with desperate, absolute terror. "It's okay, baby," I whispered, holding him fiercely, feeling the tiny, hidden microphone brush against his suit. "Mommy is here. I've got you." The entire room fell dead silent. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The guests turned to stare at the deeply uncomfortable, highly emotional scene unfolding in the foyer. Bianca's face flushed dark red with absolute, furious embarrassment. The perfect, pristine illusion she had bought was completely shattered by the child, calling another woman mommy. Julian Cross immediately stepped forward, his slick, arrogant lawyer persona taking complete control of the narrative. "Everyone, I apologize for the interruption," Julian announced smoothly to the silent crowd, flashing a charming, deeply reassuring smile. "This is simply a minor family transition. The child is experiencing some expected separation anxiety from his former guardian. Please, enjoy the champagne. We will handle this privately." Julian walked quickly toward me. My father, Preston, and my husband, Evan, immediately followed him. They surrounded me like a pack of wolves cornering a wounded animal. "Let go of him, Annalise," Evan hissed under his breath, grabbing my arm aggressively. "You promised your mother you wouldn't cause a scene," Julian ordered quietly, gesturing down a dark hallway. "Get her out of front of the guests." I didn't fight them. I didn't scream for help. I played the exact role they expected me to play: the defeated, completely crushed mother who had come to surrender. I stood up, holding Miles tightly against my chest, and let them herd me down the hallway and into Julian's massive, heavily soundproofed private study. Julian closed the heavy oak doors, the lock clicking loudly into place, completely shutting out the noise of the party. Bianca stormed into the room right behind us, absolutely furious. "You are completely ruining the party, Annalise," Bianca shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at me. "I spent thousands of dollars to introduce him to our friends, and you come in here looking like a hysterical mess. He was doing perfectly fine until you showed up." "He's terrified, Bianca," I said quietly, playing my part flawlessly, letting a fam slightly to project utter defeat. "He doesn't want to be here. He wants to go home. This is his home now," Preston Vale stated coldly, stepping forward. My father looked at me with absolute, unyielding disdain. "You clearly cannot handle the stress of motherhood, Annalise. You are severely unbalanced. Julian has documented your erratic behavior. Evan has confirmed it. It is entirely in the boy's best interest to be raised by a stable, wealthy family. You can't just take him," I pleaded, holding Miles closer, ensuring my lapel microphone was perfectly positioned to catch every single word in the quiet study. "You can't just buy a child because Bianca wants one." The bait was perfectly placed. I waited for the arrogance to bite. Preston scoffed, a dark, deeply arrogant smile spreading across his face. "I can buy absolutely anything I want, Annalise," Preston stated, his voice ringing with absolute confidence. He was entirely unaware that he was speaking directly into the ears of an FBI tactical squad waiting outside his gates. "I paid $500,000 to completely erase Evan's gambling debts. I paid for his signature. I bought the legal transfer. It's done. You cannot fight my money." $500,000, I asked, looking directly at Evan, forcing tears into my eyes. "Evan, you sold our son to pay a bookie." Evan looked incredibly uncomfortable, refusing to meet my eyes. He shifted his weight, nervously adjusting the cuffs of his expensive shirt. "I didn't have a choice, Annalise," Evan muttered defensively, desperate to justify his massive betrayal. The offshore syndicate was threatening to break my legs. They knew where I worked. Preston offered to clear the debt. All I had to do was sign the papers Julian drafted. It's better for Miles anyway. Bianca can give him a better life, and I get to keep my career. The confession was flawless. Evan had just explicitly admitted to accepting a massive bribe in exchange for facilitating a kidnapping to avoid violent offshore retaliation. "But the police," I stammered, continuing the performance of the confused, helpless victim. "If I show the police the wire transfer, if I tell them Evan was bribed," Julian Cross laughed. It was a cold, incredibly arrogant, deeply condescending laugh. He walked behind his massive mahogany desk and leaned against it, looking at me as if I were an incredibly slow, entirely pathetic child. "You aren't going to show the police anything, Annalise," Julian stated smugly, "because there is absolutely no digital trace connecting Preston's money to Evan's gambling debt." "I'm an accountant, Julian," I argued weakly. "I can find the money." "Not when I move it," Julian bragged, his massive ego entirely unable to resist explaining his own brilliance. He was taking a victory lap right over a massive federal landmine. Preston wired the money into the highly secure, heavily protected escrow trust account of my law firm. It was legally categorized as an anonymous client retainer. I then transferred it through a layered LLC into a completely untraceable offshore account to pay the bookies. Julian smiled, completely intoxicated by his own legal power. "You can't audit my law firm, Annalise," Julian concluded smoothly. "The transfer is entirely protected by attorney-client privilege. If you go to the police, you will look like a completely hysterical, paranoid woman inventing massive conspiracies because you lost custody of your child." It was perfect. It was absolute, undeniable, flawlessly recorded audio evidence of Julian explicitly admitting to massive federal money laundering and conspiracy to commit kidnapping, using a corporate law firm to facilitate the crime. I had everything Agent Reyes needed. "Now," Preston said, walking over to Julian's desk. He picked up a pen and a single crisp piece of paper. He also picked up a heavy, extremely official-looking legal document. Preston walked back over to me and dropped the papers onto a small side table. "This is a non-disclosure agreement," Preston explained coldly. "It legally binds you to absolute silence regarding this entire arrangement. If you speak to the police, the press, or anyone else, Julian will sue you into total bankruptcy." He picked up the pen and quickly wrote out a check. He tore it from the book and placed it on top of the NDA. "And this," Preston continued, his voice dripping with absolute contempt, "is a cashier's check for $100,000. It is a highly generous severance package. You will sign the NDA, you will leave Miles here, you will take the money, and you will walk out of my house quietly." I looked at the check. $100,000 to completely erase my existence from my son's life. I held Miles tighter. I looked at Bianca, who was glaring impatiently at me. I looked at Evan, the coward who had sold his family to save his own legs. I looked at Julian, the arrogant lawyer who thought he was completely untouchable. And I looked at my father, who genuinely believed that money could rewrite reality. They thought the performance was over. They thought I was completely broken. The performance was over. But I wasn't the one who was broken. I stopped crying. The manufactured fear instantly vanished from my face, replaced by a cold, deeply lethal, absolute calm. I stood up straight. I reached out, picked up the $100,000 check, and methodically, deliberately tore it directly in half. Then I tore it again. I let the shredded pieces of paper flutter to the floor of the massive study. "What the hell are you doing?" Preston demanded, his face flushing dark red with anger. "Are you insane?" "Sign the document." "I'm not signing anything, Preston," I said, my voice completely flat, echoing with a terrifying absolute authority that they had never heard from me before. I reached into the pocket of my trench coat. I didn't pull out a pen. I pulled out a thick, heavily sealed, highly official legal folder. I tossed it onto Julian's mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy, deeply satisfying thud. Julian frowned, looking at the folder. "What is that?" "You are an incredibly brilliant corporate lawyer, Julian," I said softly, stepping toward the desk. "You engineered a flawless financial laundering scheme. You drafted an airtight psychological evaluation. You built an incredible legal cage to steal my son." Julian stared at me, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of genuine unease, finally cracking his arrogant facade. But you aren't a family law attorney, are you, Julian? I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. You don't understand the nuances of the county court system. You were so incredibly arrogant, so utterly confident in your own brilliance, that you forgot to do the most basic fundamental task of any legal transfer. I pointed at the folder on the desk. You forgot to check the docket, I stated clearly. Julian's unease violently shifted into absolute panic. He reached out, grabbed the folder, and ripped it open. He pulled out the certified, judge-signed legal document. His eyes rapidly scanned the heavy legal text. As he read the words, the blood completely drained from his face. He turned a sickly, horrifying shade of pale. He looked exactly like Evan had looked when he saw the severed GPS bracelet. What is it, Julian? Bianca asked nervously, stepping forward. What does it say? Julian couldn't speak. He was completely paralyzed. Tell them, Julian, I commanded coldly. Julian slowly looked up from the document, his eyes wide with absolute terror. It's a voluntary relinquishment of parental rights, Julian whispered, his voice trembling violently. Signed by Evan. 12 months ago. What? Preston snapped, grabbing the paper from Julian's hands. What does that mean? It means, I said, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable victory, that 12 months ago, to protect his assets from a civil lawsuit, Evan legally and permanently surrendered all of his parental rights. I am the sole legal and physical guardian of Miles. The absolute, catastrophic reality of the situation finally crashed down on the room. Evan's signature on your fake custody transfer is completely, utterly void, I explained, ensuring they completely understood the massive federal grave they had just dug for themselves. He had absolutely no legal authority to consent to Miles leaving my home. Which means this isn't a civil custody dispute. I looked directly at Julian, the arrogant mastermind who had just realized he was completely destroyed. When you removed my son from my home without my consent and transported him across state lines to this estate, I stated coldly, listing the charges like an executioner reading a sentence, you committed federal kidnapping. And when you used your law firm trust account to wire $500,000 to an offshore syndicate to facilitate that kidnapping, you committed massive federal wire fraud, extortion, bribery, and money laundering. Bianca gasped, stumbling backward as if she had been physically struck. Kidnapping? We didn't kidnap him. Evan said we could take him. Evan is an accomplice, Bianca, I replied flatly. And you are all going to federal prison. Evan panicked. He completely, violently panicked. You can't prove any of this, Evan shouted desperately, looking wildly toward the locked door of the study. Julian hid the money. It's your word against ours. We have the best lawyers in the state. Evan turned and sprinted toward the door, intending to flee the house before the reality fully set in. I didn't try to stop him. I simply looked at my watch. You're right, Evan, I said softly, my voice completely calm as he desperately grabbed the brass handle of the heavy oak door. I am just a working-class accountant. I can't arrest you. I looked at the locked door. But I didn't come here to arrest you, I added, speaking directly into the hidden microphone in my lapel. I came here to keep you in this room until they arrived. Evan pulled the door handle. Before the door could swing open, it violently exploded inward. The heavy oak doors shattered off their hinges as a massive steel battering ram smashed through the frame. The study was instantly flooded with incredibly bright tactical lights. FBI. Nobody move. A massive, heavily armored tactical agent screamed, storming into the room with his weapon raised. Agent Mateo Reyes walked into the study right behind him, his eyes locking instantly on Julian Cross. The raid had officially begun. The sheer, violent chaos of the FBI raid was absolutely breathtaking to witness. Evan, who had been desperately trying to open the door, was violently thrown backward by the force of the breaching ram. 2 tactical agents immediately swarmed him. They grabbed his arms, spun him around, and violently slammed him face first onto the polished hardwood floor. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly in the room. Evan Porter, you are under federal arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping and wire fraud, an agent shouted, pressing his knee into the small of Evan's back, completely immobilizing him. Evan didn't fight back. He lay completely flat on the floor, sobbing hysterically, his incredibly expensive suit ruined, his entire life completely, permanently destroyed by his own profound cowardice. Preston Vale, the arrogant patriarch, who had confidently declared that he could buy anything he wanted, attempted to maintain his position of supreme authority. He stood up straight, smoothing the lapels of his suit, completely refusing to accept the reality of the situation. "Agents, I demand that you leave my property immediately," Preston shouted, his voice echoing with the indignant outrage of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. "I am Preston Vale. You have absolutely no right to enter this estate without a warrant." Agent Reyes walked slowly toward Preston. He didn't yell. He didn't look intimidated. He looked at my father with the cold, absolute disgust of a man who spent his life hunting arrogant criminals. Reyes reached into his tactical vest, pulled out a thick, heavily stamped federal warrant, and pressed it directly against Preston's chest. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest, Mr. Vale," Reyes stated coldly. "Signed by a federal judge exactly 40 minutes ago, authorizing the immediate breach of this property to recover a kidnapped child. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "This is an outrage," Preston roared, finally realizing the sheer magnitude of the nightmare. "I will have your badge for this. Julian, do something." Julian Cross, the brilliant, arrogant mastermind who had built the entire conspiracy, couldn't do anything. He was standing behind his massive mahogany desk, completely paralyzed. He stared at the certified custody order resting on the polished wood. He stared at the torn pieces of the $100,000 check scattered on the floor. He realized that his incredible arrogance had just cost him his entire life. Two tactical agents flanked the desk. They grabbed Julian, violently twisting his arms behind his back. Julian didn't fight. He was entirely broken. He let them handcuff him, his eyes staring blankly at the floor. "Julian Cross," Agent Reyes announced, his voice ringing clearly in the quiet study. "You are under arrest for federal money laundering, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and wire fraud. Your law firm's escrow accounts have been completely frozen by the federal government, and your partners are currently being raided by an entirely separate task force." Julian closed his eyes, a tiny, pathetic whimper escaping his lips. He knew exactly what it meant. He was going to federal prison. He was going to be aggressively disbarred. He was going to lose absolutely everything. Bianca was the only one left standing, the golden child. The beautiful, incredibly spoiled sister who had thrown a welcome party for a child she had stolen, genuinely believing she was entitled to keep him. She stood in the corner of the study, wearing her stunning designer gown, completely surrounded by heavily armed federal agents. She looked at her father being handcuffed. She looked at her husband being dragged toward the door. "Annalise," Bianca whispered, her voice trembling violently, the arrogance completely gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. "Annalise, please. Tell them to stop. Tell them it's a mistake. We're family. You can't do this to us." I stood in the center of the room, holding Miles tightly against my chest. I looked at the sister who had maliciously conspired to steal my son, entirely convinced that I was completely unworthy of being a mother, simply because I wasn't as wealthy as she was. "You aren't my family, Bianca," I said softly, my voice completely cold. "You are just the people I used to know." I turned my back on her and walked out of the study. The scene in the grand foyer was even more chaotic than the study. The FBI tactical team had completely locked down the entire estate. The 300 wealthy guests, the politicians, the real estate developers, the elite socialites who had been drinking champagne and eating expensive hors d'oeuvres, were standing in absolute, paralyzed shock. They were watching the heavily armed agents secure the perimeter. They were watching the string quartet frozen in terror. And then they watched the grand finale. The heavy oak doors of the study swung open. Preston Vale, the immensely wealthy patriarch, was frog-marched out of the room, his hands securely handcuffed behind his back. Evan Porter, the charming investment broker, was dragged out next, his face stained with tears, his suit covered in dust from the floor. And finally, Julian Cross, the brilliant, untouchable corporate lawyer, was escorted out, completely humiliated, entirely defeated. The three men were paraded directly through the center of the grand foyer, right in front of the massive crowd of local elite. The absolute, breathtaking humiliation was complete. They had hosted a massive party to celebrate their arrogance, and they were leaving it in federal handcuffs. Marjorie Vale, my mother, was standing near the grand staircase. She had been mingling with the guests when the FBI breached the doors. She watched her husband and her son-in-law being dragged toward the exit, completely unable to process the total destruction of her perfect, deeply manicured reality. She saw me standing near the door, holding Miles. She ran toward me, her expensive jewelry clinking loudly, her face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate panic. "Annalise!" Marjorie screamed, completely abandoning her polite, cold demeanor. "Annalise, stop them. You have to stop them. They are arresting your father. They are arresting Julian. You are completely destroying our family over a misunderstanding." I didn't step back. I didn't flinch. I held my son tightly and looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had left a severed GPS bracelet in a box on my front porch. "I'm not destroying the family, Marjorie," I replied, my voice completely steady, echoing clearly in the silent foyer. "I am simply balancing the ledger. You bought my son. Now we are your family." Marjorie begged, tears streaming down her face, desperately trying to grab my arm. Agent Reyes stepped quickly between us, placing a firm, unyielding hand on my mother's shoulder, physically separating her from me. "Step back, ma'am," Reyes ordered coldly. "Do not interfere with the victims of a federal kidnapping." Marjorie stopped, completely paralyzed by the word victims. She finally realized that she possessed absolutely no power in this situation. Her wealth, her status, her massive estate, none of it meant anything against the crushing weight of a federal indictment. She looked at me, a pathetic, completely broken woman. I didn't say another word. I didn't offer a final insult. They had entirely destroyed themselves, and I didn't need to add anything to the wreckage. I turned around, carried my son out the massive front doors of the mansion, and walked away from my family forever. 6 months later, the legal fallout from the Ravenwood estate raid was absolute and entirely devastating, because we had flawless, undeniable audio recordings of the explicit confessions in the study. And because my forensic trace of the $500 zero-wire transfer was completely bulletproof, none of them even attempted to take the case to trial. They all accepted massive federal plea deals to avoid decades in maximum security prison. Julian Cross was formally and permanently disbarred. His massive corporate law firm entirely collapsed under the weight of the massive federal investigation into their trust accounts. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for money laundering and conspiracy. Evan Porter was sentenced to 5 years. The offshore gambling syndicate, realizing he had been arrested and their money had been seized as federal evidence, completely abandoned him. He lost his career, his freedom, and his son. Preston Vale managed to avoid prison time due to his age, and a massive team of incredibly expensive defense lawyers. But the federal fines, combined with the catastrophic collapse of Vale Capital Holdings due to the extremely public scandal, entirely bankrupted him. Bianca and Marjorie were not criminally charged, as they hadn't actively participated in the financial transactions, but the social and financial ruin was absolute. The massive Ravenwood estate was seized and sold at auction to cover Preston's federal fines. They moved into a small, rented condominium, completely ostracized from the wealthy society they had desperately worshipped. I didn't stay in the city to watch them fall. I packed up my house, finalized my incredibly aggressive, completely uncontested divorce from Evan, and moved 3 states away to a quiet, beautiful coastal town. I used my savings to open my own independent forensic accounting firm. I didn't work 80-hour weeks anymore. I worked exactly as much as I wanted, taking cases that actually mattered to me, hunting the invisible money that criminals tried to hide. On a bright, sunny Saturday morning in late spring, I was standing in the kitchen of our new house, making pancakes. The windows were open, letting in the cool, salty ocean breeze. Miles was sitting at the kitchen table, aggressively coloring a picture of a massive, heavily armored superhero. He was laughing, completely safe, incredibly happy. The terrifying night at the massive estate had faded into a distant, manageable memory. He didn't wear a GPS tracking bracelet anymore. He didn't need one. I set a plate of pancakes in front of him. He smiled, his eyes completely bright and entirely fearless. "Thanks, Mom," Miles said, immediately diving into the food. "You're welcome, baby," I smiled, kissing the top of his head. I walked over to the open window and looked out at the quiet, peaceful street. My family thought they were incredibly smart. They thought their massive wealth, their brilliant corporate lawyers, and their absolute, breathtaking arrogance made them entirely untouchable. They thought they could buy a child like a piece of luxury furniture, simply because they believed they were superior to the working-class accountant. They made a catastrophic miscalculation. They thought my love for my son would make me a hysterical, completely reckless victim. They expected me to scream, cry, and eventually surrender under the massive weight of their legal pressure. They were wrong. My love for my son didn't make me reckless. It made me entirely, flawlessly lethal. So, tell me honestly in the comments below, if your incredibly wealthy family and your gambling-addicted husband actively conspired to kidnap your 6-year-old son, paid a $500,000 bribe to completely erase his parental rights, and tried to trap you in a fake custody transfer engineered by a brilliant corporate lawyer, would you panic, scream at the police, and try to desperately fight them in court, exactly like they planned? Or would you quietly pack your laptop, follow the massive wire transfer, and casually walk into their welcome party wearing a hidden microphone to deliver them directly to an FBI tactical squad? Let me know. I read every single one.